welcome back, everybody, to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. And it's good to have you back with me for this conversation today. I'm particularly pleased to have with me a good friend and colleague from the John Curtin Research Centre, Dr Dominic Meagher. And Dom, great to have you. And just to give people an idea of your background, I know that you're currently an economist at the ANU Crawford School's Centre for Climate and Energy and the policy dynamics of all that. So you couldn't possibly have a more appropriate and expert person to be talking with us today. And in particular, Dom's had quite a spectacular career of research and academic work that spanned a number of countries. He's done work in China and Hong Kong and around Australia. And so he's been very productive in terms of what he's turned out in that research, which is fantastic. And because really we've been through a time when we really need to focus our political leaders and our department heads and those captains of industry, etc., who've got a lot to contribute to this challenge that the nation faces, which is really a kind of bit of a perfect storm at the moment with security issues in terms of physical security and the more conventional some threats that we face, but also compounding that, the national security issues associated with the disaster situation. And so, as you might recall, we've had a bit of a lead up to this conversation where we've had the excellent commentary from Will Howard, who's a genuine climate scientist and has given us that backdrop of what it's all about and where we're heading to next, and some of the broader issues around what we might do about climate change in general. But that was setting the scene for the conversation we then had with Leanne Barnes, who was the general manager at Bega Council during the horrendous period of 2019 to 20, which was so devastating for the region that I was privileged to represent, and which sort of highlighted to me the types of challenges that we were facing just on the ground for these things and what we might need to do about it nationally. And so that then leads into this conversation. And serving it particularly has been the work that Dom has done with a research paper that he produced in October 2025, which was entitled Safer, Stronger, Sovereign, Preparing Australia for Climate Disasters. And that really covered off on quite a gamut of things, beginning with the concept of how we deal with our voluntary sector and responses to disasters and first responders, and the challenges they face on the broader scale of disasters and frequency of them. And then he moved into some of the issues around manufacturing, resilient infrastructure, the economic impacts and the potential benefits of what we might suggest as solutions, and then the employment and regional diplomacy elements and national security elements. So it was a very comprehensive report, and I was privileged to participate in that, but it really was mainly Dom's detailed and extensive research and being able to bring to bear to that how we might accommodate solutions economically, which is really the key to it all at the end of the day, and how we pay for these things. So Dom, really pleased to have you here, and just reflecting on this, it wasn't just the disasters that we had in 2020 to 2025, but also compounding that in the middle of it was the COVID situation, which highlighted a few things about supply chain issues. And now we're seeing that compounded by our fuel issues and challenges. And we've conversed with Justin Howden about how we might meet that challenge technically and in terms of the science around biodiesel fuels and things like that. So, Mike, the report you did, what would you say if you were to sort of summarize the key sort of take out from the challenges that the nation faces from all these dynamics compounding together?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks for that generous introduction, and also for your really generous contributions when we were writing this work. It really helped a lot to be able to run it past you and make sure that we weren't saying anything too crazy. Although obviously anything that we did say that was off point remains entirely our fault. Uh, um, in terms of the challenges that we're facing now, I mean, obviously the big one is that climate change and global warming mean the kind of disasters we saw, those bushfires and also floods and other things like this are becoming more intense and more frequent. And of course, you can't say one particular such event is due to climate change, but the frequency and the intensity of them is certainly getting more. And that means we need a much more robust way of dealing with it, right? We saw, I mean, in the fires that you're talking about, you know, th- I mean, it was off the charts, and we had, you know, we had to mobilize huge mobilization of the defense force with Operation Bushfire Assist. The Navy did amphibious evacuations of the south or just south of the New South Wales in Victoria, and you see these kind of things, and now every time there's an event like this, the first thing anyone asks is, "Where's the ADF?" Uh, and this is a big challenge because, of course, the ADF has its own mission to do, and that's increasingly serious itself.
Yeah.
And we would like to see them focused on that. Um, and so one of the challenges amongst the many is that we need capability that doesn't rely on the ADF to be able to mobilize to these kind of things. So this is the sort of situation that we were looking at when we were writing this, and I don't think we were alone in our assessment of things. There are other people talking about this a lot at the time. Even Murray Watt was the minister, I think, when we put this out. He'd been talking about it sort of every now and again, but it hadn't really managed to get really driven forward. And so we wanted to, look at a bit more precisely what we could do. And the big question that we, I guess, looked at is, when you have a disaster like this, the thing you need is a whole lot of people who are mobilized for a brief period of time, who know what they're doing, know how to be coordinated. It's not often super complex skills for a lot of the work that needs to be done. You just need a lot of people to show up and know the system. And so that was the first sort of part of it that we were looking at. How do you create a system where you can have a lot of people trained in these basic skills and able to be mobilized? And I guess the other part of this equation there is, you know, when you've got the people, they also need to be equipped and have the right gear. Or it's pretty hard to put out a bushfire deal with your bare hands.
Yep.
Uh, yeah, but so those are the sort of two parts of the equation.
Yeah, some of those practical dynamics were really stark for me in my region as I'd move around depots for the RFS, for example. You could see this, very aging cohort,
Mm,
and they're people who are fantastic and really well intentioned, but more and more you're talking about people who would be better focused on the comms side of things, on doing the sandwiches and all that sort of thing. But for people needing to be on fire lines for weeks at a time,
yeah,
it was really challenging. And I had them calling out to me saying, "Mike, we're breaking. We've never had this kind of tempo. And the concept of rotating teams that we had, it's just not holding up to this. And we've all
mm,
got day jobs, and maintain and all that sort of thing." So, the challenge of that also amplified by the fact that voluntarism in Australia was declining and still is. There's been studies on that. There's a parliamentary report on it. There's the various organisations that look at these things have noted that we worked from a peak of about 36% of adults in 2010 down to about 25% in recent years. And so voluntarism wasn't keeping up.
yeah,
And to your point, you know, you also have to prepare people for these things. And I had a lot of people screaming at me when I was calling out for the mobilisation of the ADF, saying, "Look, they're not trained to fight fires." And I said, "Well, I don't necessarily want them to fight fires. I need people to be evacuated. I need logistics support. I need forward air refueling points or forward refueling points, because petrol stations had gone down. The fireys couldn't fuel their vehicles. you had transport issues, you had support for evacuation centres, you had the need for heavy engineering plant to clear breaks, all these sorts of things, the firebombing. And one of the things that the Climate Council really highlighted back then was that by 2030, we were going to be needing to double our firefighting force. And we had this overlap with the Northern and Southern Hemisphere now around fire challenges. So sharing those air assets internationally was becoming more challenging. So that pointed to the need for maybe more air capability indigenous to Australia. So that, all of these dynamics were really saying, well, what is the solution to this? And, I sort of raised at the time the idea of moving back to a kind of a community service regime, not national service in that sense of drafting everybody into the military, but a regime of being able to revisit sort of like a civil defence capability. And your report highlights examples of that. We could talk about that, but and I zeroed in on potentially two sort of underpinnings of that. One could be incentivizing it, like, getting kids out of high school to commit to a year of this in exchange for HECS forgiveness, for example. And then if that wasn't working, look at a scheme of maybe mobilisation regimes that, made it compulsory to go and do a year's worth of this stuff after high school if we weren't keeping up. So I sort of threw that out there as a bit of a provocation to the debate. But then you then produced a solution to this in the report. And could you describe that?
Yeah, sure. And yeah, you cover a lot of ground there. And one thing I want to go back to, which is maybe at the beginning of describing that, is you mentioned the volunteers, the fantastic volunteers we've had over the decades, and maybe your characterization of their current levels are a bit fine because you're amazed with a lot of them, but I would correct you as far as to say that they should be making sandwiches. But I think actually what we were looking for them to do is participate in training the next generation, and for that to be paid as part of recognition for the work they've done as volunteers over the decades. Because that is been so invaluable to Australia, and I think a lot of them have sacrificed a lot to do that. They could have been earning more for their retirement, and I think there's a good opportunity now to give a bit of tangible thanks, as well as the sort of emotional thanks for that work by enlisting them as paid trainers for the next generation.
Yes.
Because what we need is a lot of trained people, and we want that sort of transfer of knowledge, intergenerational knowledge. Um, and so the system we proposed was essentially a paid training system. Voluntary, anyone could sign up, and anyone who wanted to participate would definitely be able to do it. So it operates a little bit like a jobs guarantee in that sense, except that it's not full time work. It's a few weeks maybe. Um, but anyone who wanted to participate and show up and do the training would get paid. We benchmarked it against the pay rate that the Army Reserve use, which from memory is $208 a day. I think that's about right for the entry level Army Reserve's pay rate, and we just benchmarked it against that, and considered, well, what would happen if over 5 years, every year you recruited 40,000 people and trained them, and then each year you added 40,000 people. So first year's 40, then 80, then 120, right? Up to nearly 200,000 by the end of the 5 years, and meaning that the people, the first year you do it, you're getting trained for the first time, but then you're getting refresher programs every year. And we costed that. It just happened to work out at $1.001 billion or something. What's the big Oz exactly? Just by coincidence. Of course, that's only the cost for the actual training part. That doesn't include the salaries for the trainers or any of the other aspects of it. But it helps benchmark. So, but then the idea here is, we would have a lot of people who could volunteer to get the training, be part of a system, be on standby, be on call, and have particular skills registered. You mentioned there's such a huge range of skills that are relevant. I mean, all those things that you said the ADF were doing that we're not fighting fires, flying planes or evacuating or refueling. having an engineer corps for rebuilding roads or making sure that roads were clear. There's so much needs to be done, and a bit of training, a few weeks of training is enough that you can work in a team that's properly led. The leaders of teams would need more skills, but if you had every person who's out there now who knows what they're doing actually in charge of a team of 10, they'd be able to get a whole lot more done. Right?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, then to your point, I mean, those people in their 70s in the fire depots, and I won't, for a minute, sort of deny the importance of preparing the food for the volunteer. Like they used to say, army marches on his stomach, but comms in these states do with the technologies with, operating drones and those sort of things is you can actually make a contribution later in life, but in particular, the valuable experience and also motivating aspect of that, to inspire in younger Australians that community spirit that those people who've done all that volunteering over so many years. And I began life as a teenager in the RFS fighting local fires to save your own homes and the rest of it. You kind of knew the incentive there, but it was also a great social thing back then too.
but you're
So, but the question is, like, you just can't have people on fire lines, at that age for weeks at a time. So, these dynamics can be kind of managed through what you're proposing here and take advantage of that experience, skills, and et cetera, and match that with the perhaps youthful capabilities to do some of that more endurance related, effort.
Mm. Look, you just mentioned the social aspect, and this is actually a really important part of the whole thing, right? Because we do lack that a bit in Australia. This opportunity to build personal connections with people that aren't necessarily from your background, right? Our schools are often religiously siloed or class siloed. Our communities are location siloed. Um, this is a thing where you can cut across all that really well, right? And we've seen countries that have national service have found that this really helps build connections between people from different opportunities and backgrounds, and especially for disadvantaged groups, it can give a leg up, right? Because they're making networks with people that are much more advantaged, and that just shares. And we're not proposing conscription or anything like that. We were proposing a sort of voluntary training, paid training and reserves kind of model. But I think you get the same kind of outcome. And of course, if it's very popular, the more popular it is, the bigger that kind of benefit is. And yeah, as you said, I think the school cohorts are a really good uh, group to focus on. Because it's this sort of meaningful national service in terms of national resilience from climate disasters. I think a lot of young people would be interested in that. I think a lot of recent Australians, new Australians, would be pretty keen to do this. There's opportunities. Not to say that they have to, but a lot of people are looking for ways to prove their sort of commitment to their new community.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that we've often thought of sport as the only available
Yeah,
vehicle for migrants to sort of do that entry into the Australian sort of culture and social cohesion part of it. And
yeah,
we all talk about social cohesion now and what a great contribution this could make to that effort. But you talk to old veterans from national service days and they all reiterate, all those things you've underlined and commented on about the way it sort of leveled out society in many ways and built that sort of community spirit across the nation, and so it builds you kind of a social license to do things that need to be done on a
mm,
national basis as well. But yeah, it's and I would call it a community service rather than national service because people are thinking of Vietnam and the history of that in our country going back to World War One has not been great.
yeah. Wouldn't go down well, I don't think.
Yeah, but there was a lot of receptivity when I raised this in the community, and particularly the ability to give young people sort of some really important life skills, even down to the basics of first aid and, but also
Yep.
project management and, all the rest of it, which you could give them, recognition for in terms of recognition for prior learning and, the basis for cert skills and
Mhm.
tastes, et cetera, those kind of things.
Absolutely. One of the things we looked at, because Jim Chalmers used to talk, well, probably talks about this still quite a bit, is overcoming entrenched disadvantage. right? And so you have a lot of Australians who've been unemployed for more than a year or even more than 2 years. Right? I think there's about 100,000 who've been trying without success to get a job for 2 years or more, and 200,000, for 1 year. And the longer it takes, the harder it is to break in, right? Because people start looking at you and go, "Well, what's wrong with this person?" Um, and so this is really, as you're saying, it's an opportunity, with no questions asked, to get some training, show you can do it, get paid, show you, which helps when when you don't have a job. But so and then it can tie into very easily employment groups, right? So if you show you can do the training, and you turn up every day, and this kind of thing, that can easily overcome that kind of let's say perception of, there must be something wrong with this person. Um, and it just proves that there's not. And then, employers who are interested in recruiting straight out of this pool, you can easily work with those, as government can easily work with those kind of employers to say, we'll give you some encouragement, maybe through payroll tax or something else, or just through certified branding, to say, you're helping this program. At the same end, at the other end of it, if employers are keeping people on, who have done this kind of program and are available to stand to be called up, that is a cost to employers to potentially have their staff vanish for a few weeks at any moment. And so I think there's opportunities to work with them there as well, to recognize employers as contributing to a program like this, with certified branding, or with potentially payroll support. Um,
Which we do with the reserves. There's sort of, I guess, incentivize it from the employer side to support these kind of things. But the benefit for a better employee is a big one. I mean, when we look at the experience we've had with young recruits into the army, for example, and people have a bit of a misconception about what that looks like in the modern world, but it's not creating robots, particularly in the Australian Army concept. I don't know about other militaries, but we've also very much focused over the years in trying to build in initiative at the lowest levels,
Mhm.
and that not to create robots. So one of the things you notice out of a kid going through recruit training is that they come out the back end of that as more confident people. They found out what they're actually capable of, and when they felt they weren't, and then found out that they were, it was a bit of an awakening. And so you had a different individual in terms of their self-confidence and ability and willingness to take on further enhancement of their skills and broadening of their horizons. So, this scheme could do a similar service in that respect.
Yeah, right. That's fantastic. I hadn't seen that research actually, but it makes a lot of sense. And in fact, in terms of defense recruitment, I think they in particular would be an obvious potential candidate for this as a sort of pipeline. Um, Not to say that everyone doing this kind of program would want to go in that direction, but I think you'd probably get higher than the average. Proportion of people that would find it rewarding. Yeah, because once you start doing a thing like this, you find that actually, I'm kind of into this kind of thing. Um,
I want to be part of
and I
something
can,
bigger than myself and contribute to the nation in whatever way possible. But yeah, and like whether they go into the military or not is sort of an open question. But just having that core of people who have been trained to deal with disasters and can be mobilised quickly, just even locally in your local town or village or whatever. But the other thing that I'm sort of interested about that is that when you talked about this in the paper, is we talk about the impact on the ADF of having to constantly use it in a roles that it's not designed for. But yes, you do use it when you need all hands to the pump. But basically, that presents a huge problem these days because the technical skills required to be a member of the Defence Force, with a higher end technology that they've got to be capable of employing and mastering.
Mhm.
If you interfere with the training cycles through these kind of multiple and regular call outs, it's hard to catch up with. It's a real problem.
Yeah.
So the impact on the ADF is that we're getting a less ready force
Mm.
through constant.
and and I think if you're frequently calling out for this kind of work, you have to also train for this kind of work to an extent. So it doubles that effect.
Mm.
Uh,
One of the things I might sort of indicators is relevant, though, to the ADF, that where this is important is those kind of assets that make such a difference. So one of the things I was hoping we could do is create another sort of reserve squadron of Chinooks, for example, because
Mhm.
they were worth their weight in gold in Afghanistan. But in disaster response, Chinooks are just incredibly useful. But also in the US, with the National Guards construct they have, they're there for disaster response. And so they'll have C-130s, for example, that are constructed and configured to be able to be used in a dual use purpose of firebombing, etc. So, one of the things we could do is, in pointing back to that issue around the fact that it's really hard to share these air assets these
Yeah.
days,
Yep.
with overlapping fire seasons, is to look at how we can dual use some of our assets of that kind, the key assets,
Mhm.
and see if that's doable. So,
Absolutely. That's a big part of it, right? And that's sort of more in the second half of the report when we start focusing on the equipment, the machinery, and leveraging the economics. So part of this, I guess there are two big ways where the economics came into this whole report. One was because it came out around a bit after the election, but we wrote a lot of it before the election, which was very focused on inflation and cost of living, right? And so we might be able to come back later, but part of that is if a flood comes through a farm or something and wipes out the crops, that's driving up food prices, right? And if it wipes out all the houses, it's driving up house insurance or making it impossible to insure. So there's that sort of inflation hit. But then, on the defense side, the defense budget is needing to grow for very well established reasons, I think, and making that economical. One thing you can do is build your economies of scale, and so what we look at is either the same assets or the same industry. How can you get more use out of them, than just the defense?
right.
And as you said, like the Chinooks are a great example. So we would it there's so the ADF uses them for the heavy lift operations, and I think Black Hawks or maybe this is slightly old now, but for the medium lift. And what else do we have? The Apaches. There's a handful of them. My accounting of it said the ADF has 74 helicopters in active service and another 72 on order. So that was probably mid last year.
Yeah. And the attack helicopters wouldn't be, sort of appropriate, but look, we're just about to get rid of these Spartan aircraft, which are, they require shorter landing grounds and less, prepared landing grounds. And so that's an interesting step forward, and I know people have raised that issue, should we be getting rid of these Spartan aircraft for that reason? But, those are the kind of considerations that we need to be a little bit more cognizant of. Well, what are you replacing
Yeah.
that with,
Well, it's not a huge number, right? That's like 140 helicopters, if you include the ones we've got and the ones we were ordering. And if you compare that, we've got over 100 air ambulance aircraft, and that's a mix of fixed wing and rotary. But if we've got 100 civilian disaster reserves aircraft and 140 military aircraft, if we're making sure that we get the most economies of scale for those orders, we can potentially order more for the same amount, for the same cost, right? And if we're making sure that we treat that as a sovereign industry, at least on the maintenance and repair side of it, if not the manufacturer as well, you can start making that economical if you're putting in bigger orders. And then that raises the question of, well, how much big can we go? And now you're looking at, okay, let's align our foreign policy with the Pacific and New Zealand on this, right? Because the Pacific Islands see climate change as their biggest existential threat. They need this kind of equipment as well, and they can't afford it by themselves. But we're very keen for it to be us that helps them, and we can make it a bit more economical for us if we're helping more than just ourselves. And then we can start looking at working with ASEAN as well. And then you've got a much bigger population who could probably contribute more of the cost themselves. If we're providing this kind of equipment to them as a sort of guaranteed sovereign service, where Indonesia knows they're going to get this stuff from us, it's going to be reliable. We can work on the maintenance with them together. The Philippines and Malaysia as well, Singapore, right? Now you're starting to get an economy of scale that makes it much more affordable to do a lot more of this here, and in the local region. And you reduce your reliance on some supply chains that maybe are good in keeping the cost down, and good at the very frontier, but maybe when push comes to shove, we're going to be busy. We're not going to be at the front of the queue.
Well, that's it. And, some of it could be that these are things you mobilise in a military crisis, but may be parked within some sort of construct within a civil offence or Australian disaster reserve construct. So the kinds of aircraft that are good for difficult landing areas or that can support these kinds of logistics issues around disaster. But the other thing that is interesting to me too, in terms of the broader economic dynamic, was that when we were in government the last time round, 2007 to 2013, and we had the global financial crisis hit, one of the things that I was tasked to do by Kevin Rudd, which wasn't made public, but we worked with Defence on an emergency concept. So it wasn't a policy to implement, but it was an emergency concept because at the time people were speculating that perhaps 250,000 people would lose their jobs. That was the figure that was kind of put on it as a possibility. And so the idea was create a scheme like the ADR on a sort of a mandatory basis. Actually, I think we were looking at it at the time, but as an option for people to do, also, which would be remunerated, but to create a scheme like this to absorb that, cohort of 250,000 people, particularly the younger ones. So that was in the context of answering an economic challenge at the time.
I remember that period quite well. That was a huge challenge, and the government got through it really well. Australia got through it amazingly well, I would have to say. But no one knew that was going to be the case. So yeah, I would say there's an element of making sure that there's definitely work to do. And if we look around the place, there's a lot of work that needs to be doing. There's so many priorities that we can't get met right now. So I don't think we ought to have any problem finding useful work to do. Right? There's no risk that of sort of make work, in my view. Right? There's just so much that's important. That's not getting that to do. That the idea of a sort of Keynesian dig a hole and fill it in again kind of scenario. No, I don't think that's on the cards. And you can definitely find work that's meaningful and productive and local. To be honest, like in people's local communities, and even better relevant to skills that they want, because there's so many skills that are involved here. From the health side of things to the evacuation and the management and the just the community care and on the manufacturing side of things, there's a lot of work.
Right.
There's so much to be getting on with. You can definitely treat it as a sort of economics backstop if you had to.
Well, let's park the conversation there for a moment, and we'll come back to really tease out those broader economic issues, the diplomatic issues you've touched on, and the manufacturing aspects of these issues, and as it plays into the broader national resilience issue and supply chain challenges. But thanks very much for that introduction, Dom. Really useful background to where we go next. And thanks for being with us on Frontlines and Faultlines. I hope you're getting a lot out of this conversation, and we'll see you again next time.